Hey guys, today I want to talk about some of my favorite obscure books. Now, I left out books that are just stories. There's a lot of interesting stories out there. I left out all fiction, and I left out anything that was too technical that you would need outside knowledge to follow and understand. Now, these are in no particular order, and it's a fairly long list, so I'm just going to rip through them. The first one is The Mystery of Metamorphosis, a scientific detective story by Frank Ryan. It is on Amazon. And I read this when this came out in 2011 and is one of the most interesting books that I've ever read. And I think one of the reasons it remains obscure, and I mean really obscure, there's nothing on YouTube about this, there's no talks from Frank Ryan that I can find anywhere. But this book, what it outlines, what it talks about, it poses a serious challenge to Darwinian evolution, and it's very difficult to address when using a lot of the comparisons that the theory of evolution relies on, such as the development of eyes and, all sorts of features that we find in the mammalian world and the reptilian and the bird world. People feel very confident about those explanations, but metamorphosis goes into the life cycles of many sea creatures, and again, it's very, very challenging for Darwinian evolution. I highly recommend this book. Next is The Peter Principle by Raymond Hall and Lawrence J. Peter. The Peter Principle was originally published in 1972, and lots of people have heard of this, but it's just nowhere near as well known as it should be. Excellent book. I think this book really actually describes most problems that we have with human organizations, and a lot of modern writing goes to lengths to explain on how we should manage people properly, whereas I think the Peter Principle and his follow-up, the Peter Prescription, I think this much better explains things, and we can implement this into a much better functioning organizational structure of humanity. Now, this next book was a bestseller when it came out in 1964, Games People Play by Eric Burney, but it needs to be more well known again today. I think a lot of modern society has gone pretty far away from the more simplistic graphical approach that they took in the 70s and 60s, and I think transactional analysis, which is the theory that Games People Play is based off of, I think it wonderfully explains a lot of human relationships and relationship issues, and knowing about games people play, can help you avoid those games with people and help you not do them yourself, and I think this is an excellent goal. So I highly recommend this book. It's one of my top 10 actually, and not just for interesting books, but also for personal development and life improvement books. Next is Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston A. Price, published first in 1939. This is a classic in the nutrition world, but also just in general understanding of how contact with modern foods really, really screwed us up, not just in our health, but in our physical appearance as well. Very well documented. Teeth problems are very common. It's something that we can all avoid, and it's part of overall health. So one of my most recommended books ever, and since it's old time, it doesn't reference anything modern, which is really cool. It really highlights the fact that we really don't need modern, fancy, technological-based medicine, because a lot of health was really already figured out before we were in contact with industrial society. Next is Heaven and Earth, Global Warming, The Missing Science by Ian Plimmer. This was published in May 2009, and outside of Australia, I really don't think many people know about this at all, and they should. This is a very big book by a very thorough scientist, and it's very well laid out. And actually, to me, having read some of these books back then, 10 years ago, it's unbelievable to me that this never got out, and the mainstream story about so-called global warming, now called climate change, has continued and even amplified. So it's extremely important that we know about this. And actually, with this reading, I would include The Counter Consensus by Robert M. Carter and The Weathermakers Re-Examined by D.W. Allen, especially if you have read The Weathermakers by Tim Flannery. Next, in 1998, Kary Mullis, who was famous for getting the Nobel Prize for his work with the PCR test, which is now a big deal in the 2020-2021 world, he put out this book called Dancing Naked in the Minefield, and it's one of the most interesting nonfiction books that I've ever read. It's fun. He describes many interesting things, including some of his thoughts about the PCR and the AIDS virus. Might as well recommend in here Inventing the AIDS Virus from 1996. But this book is well worth the read. It's not a challenging read, and it's super interesting. Now, I'm including Sam Harris on this list because he is well known, but he's more known for his religious and political views, and I feel that 3 of his best works have been completely discounted or overlooked or just not talked about because of his political or religious views. So I highly recommend this triple release of books here, 3 years in a row. The Moral Landscape in 2010, Lion in 2011, and Free Will in 2012. And I think each of these concepts has the ability really to encourage a very positive cultural shift in each one of those ideas. And I think it's incredibly important. I include Free Will and Lion actually as a pair because they're both very small books, and I include them on my top 10 as well. When people ask me for top personal development books, I think understanding those concepts of Free Will and Lion, whether you're an atheist or a creationist or whatever you believe, it doesn't matter to me. In my opinion, it fits with all of the belief systems, so highly recommend it. I'm also including David Graeber here, even though he's another modern guy who is pretty well known, at least in the book reading world. The problem is not a lot of people read books, so most books remain obscure even if they are New York Times bestsellers. In any case, I've met very few people who have read David Graeber, any of his books, and I've met even fewer people who understand David Graeber's thesis. And he's my favorite modern writer. He died last year in 2020, and I recommend all of his books, especially Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and The Utopia of Rules and Bullshit Jobs. Next is an obscure book that is quite relevant in today's political climate. This was published in 1992 by Anne Moir and David Jessel. It's called Brain Sex, The Real Difference Between Men and Women. And it's good to know that there are many physiological differences, and many of them are very interesting, and it's not really sensible to look at people as equal for many reasons. You know, equality is very misunderstood as a goal. I believe that, and that's important. A lot of what we're doing in our political times right now is to level the playing field for everyone, and some of this means that we're giving children the rights basically to choose as if they were adults on many important things, and children are not supposed to be equal to adults. Sex differences have led to this whole equality thing being pushed into law, and I think that has very serious consequences. So this is definitely something that we should understand much more thoroughly. Next, there could be a lot of political books that I could recommend that would be obscure, because when you go into a bookstore, you really only see one version of the political theater as we see it basically on TV. It's the same kind of version that we see in the mainstream bookstore, so there's lots and lots of political content that falls outside of that, and lots of it I could recommend, though it would be in my too technical category. Some of them are really well written about things that we really wouldn't know about otherwise, and one of them is John Perkins. In 2004 he published Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and then in 2007 he followed that up with The Secret History of the American Empire. And they're both super interesting, and they're not difficult long reads, and I highly recommend them. To follow up with that, I would kind of just blanketly recommend Michael Parenti. He's written a whole bunch of books, and they're a very different take on the exact same political characters that we're used to hearing about. Sort of in line with Noam Chomsky or other more mainstream figures, but I think Michael Parenti always kept it a little bit more real, and I enjoyed his writing. I first heard of John Perkins on Zeitgeist, one of the Zeitgeist movies, and I also first heard of Jack Fresco on the Zeitgeist movies. I really enjoy Jack Fresco's books. They are very idealistic, of course, but I think it's really good to examine the extreme scenarios and what could extreme cooperation look like? What could extreme technical democracy look like, right? A lot of people kind of threw Peter Joseph away and Jack Fresco away as socialists, whereas I think Jack Fresco specifically, his technological solutions to our human problems doesn't have anything to do with politics, in my opinion. And in my opinion, although we might be theoretically best without government completely, as long as we do have any type of a democratic framework, I think we should utilize technology. I think we should utilize the internet. I think we can actually do democracy directly through the internet, through something like Facebook. And we could all vote on where our money goes. And I think if we could vote on where our money goes, we might put it towards building stuff like Jack Fresco outlines, at least in the civic infrastructure. But more deeply, a big part of the Fresco message and the Peter Joseph message is getting rid of things like the military and some of the huge wastes of money. Me in the health business, I would say get rid of healthcare costs, right, dude? So we're talking trillions of dollars that could easily be diverted to the types of infrastructure that would just really be for the improvement of humanity. And by the way, a lot of people would recommend Buckminster Fuller, but I think Jack Fresco, he picked up right off of Buckminster Fuller's work, and I just think he did a better job in presenting it. Buckminster Fuller is really weird with words. It's really weird to read his books, and the same basic ideas are really expanded upon for many decades by Jack Fresco. Next, I'm just going to also blanketly recommend Rupert Sheldrake. Rupert Sheldrake has never disappointed me. All of his books are interesting. Even where some of them overlap, they're still worth reading. Every single one of them. His concept, his theory of morphic fields and morphic resonance, I think that is the correct theory of the world. I think that is the world that we live in. I believe this. And all of us, on the new age sort of side of things, believe in frequencies and energy and that kind of stuff. It all goes completely in line with this worldview. It explains many things that many of us have really never even questioned because there is no framework to question it. And I recently shared my favorite lecture of his on my channel. Now, actually, when I first read Rupert Sheldrake's morphic field theory, it made me immediately think of The Extended Phenotype by Richard Dawkins. And I didn't know that these two do not get along publicly, and that they're on very opposite sides of a very political scientific fence. I always considered The Extended Phenotype Dawkins' best work, and almost nobody talks about that book. He's another figure that it has his religious and political views more focused on than his actual work. Now, this is another concept that I really think is worth revisiting. This book was published in 1996, War Before Civilization, The Myth of the Peaceful Savage, by Lawrence H. Keeley. This is very interesting, but this also connects to a popular book by Steven Pinker. And this big book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, published in 2011, I think is a really great book, actually. I really don't agree with Steven Pinker about many things, but he always puts a lot of backbone into whatever he's trying to say. And in this case, this argument, I think, is correct. I think a lot of people do confuse the natural way of things with the peaceful way of things, and I don't think that is correct. So moving forward, this is particularly why I lean more towards the Jack Fresco solutions to things, because they don't rely purely on our supposed natural instincts. We do, I think, require technology in order to happily live together, basically. And I don't mean iPhones, I just mean the more tools that we have, the easier our life is. In the case of organizing millions or billions of people, especially democratically, I do think we need technology to facilitate that, because we're not all going to go and live in small communities. And The Better Angels of Our Nature and War Before Civilization both make a very good case that that might not be the ideal situation for us. Now, this book from 2010 got me really excited. The Vertical Farm, Feeding the World in the 21st Century by Dixon Disbaumer. And this is another thing where, reading it 10 years ago, I was really convinced that in 10 years' time we'd be significantly closer to this as a world. Now, not only are we talking about growing food in buildings and that being an economically viable solution for a lot of the problems of modern agriculture, but we're also talking about appliances that can grow our own vegetables and herbs and simple things in our houses automatically. Now, this was totally, completely within reach in 2010, and it's more in reach now. And that we have heard almost nothing about this from the mainstream, or there's no chatter about this. I know of one major vertical farm project, but there's millions of dollars behind it. It's all private money. And it's a good idea for private companies, but it's also a good idea for everybody. It's a good idea for retail type products to get on board with this, like producing refrigerators, producing another machine that can go in the kitchen that can grow a lot of a family's needs of fresh produce. And the fresh produce, that's when it's best. That's when it's got the most life in it. That's when it's got the most nutrients in it. And I could go on and on. Actually, I probably will make my own video going all into this as a really viable solution for a lot of problems, and being a really, really good use of money and effort in our future. So I highly recommend this book. It's a really great outline. There's no better book that outlines the concept better, in my opinion. Here's another book from 2011. It was a good year for books. This one with the ridiculously long title, Zapped: Why Your Cell Phone Shouldn't Be Your Alarm Clock and 1268 Ways to Outsmart the Hazards of Electronic Pollution by Anne-Louise Gittleman. Now, this book is just my favorite, clearest book on the everyday sources of radiation around us, and this is just critical for us to understand and to avoid these things. And it's also critical in connection with our business and the health business, because if people are being infected by radiation, they're not going to have an easy time on our nutrition program, not as easy as they should. So everybody should understand this. Everybody should read this book. Next, and we're approaching the end of our list here, this book in 2001 by Kevin D. Mitnick, The Art of Deception, is one of the most interesting books out there. It has a lot to do with human psychology, but basically this is hacking. This is a hacker's sort of expose on what hacking really is. And what's most interesting about this is most people think that hacking is like using computer codes and stuff, being a computer nerd, whereas Mitnick goes into how it is mostly actually just manipulating people, and that people are usually the weakest link in any security system. And so that's where hackers, real hackers looking for real information or to really mess with a person or an organization, that's how they do it. So understanding this should definitely help us avoid getting scammed and getting taken advantage of. Next is a quick and important little book called 5 Steps to Conquer Death by PowerPoint, Changing the World One Conversation at a Time by Eric Bergman. Now, I actually know this guy. He's a really nice guy, and this book really changed my mind on how to present information, quite honestly. And although it's focused on PowerPoint, it's all completely relevant to everything that we do on social media, basically. And just understanding how people interpret information and how to best present it is absolutely key. This is a really short little book. I would recommend it to anybody trying to present any information to anybody. Last on my list for today is a book called The Halo Effect, published in 2007. And this is the most recent book actually that I was really impressed with, that really made me re-examine a lot of the other books that I had read. This book is about business, but I feel like the halo effect and understanding that is really giving me a much more critical eye to a lot of things that are presented in a very positive light. Now, the halo effect is summed up by the tendency for positive impressions of a person, company, brand, or product in one area to positively influence one's opinion or feelings in other areas. This is to say that they're being judged on the outcome. This is just incredibly important, and I know that my little 30-second spiel on it is not going to explain it, so I think everybody should read the halo effect actually and apply it to life generally. Well, that's my list for today, guys. I appreciate you, and I know it's a weird kind of a subject, but if you appreciate this kind of content, let me know in the comments. I've read a lot of books, and a lot of people want to know sort of what are the best to go to in certain areas, so I could come up with a list for pretty much any topic. But for now, that's it. Take care. We'll see you next time. And definitely check out my newest book, Fake Diseases. It covers all of the major topics that come up, like birth defects, blood sugar problems, bone and joint problems, cancer, autoimmune problems, and more. And it's on Amazon for just $9.99. And the audiobook read-along version is free here on YouTube, and the link for that is in the description of this video. And make sure to check out my art account, Notus Art. Got a lot of stuff on there, but I've also thrown up pretty much a free course in how to paint in oils and do it economically. I'm gonna put lots of other stuff there, and I've also published a book of my drawings. It's kind of my life work. It's about 20 years worth of drawings, and it's up on Amazon at a pretty good price, I think.